On June the 20th, 2018, died at the age of 91 Mrs. Willie Lee Rose, an American historian whose short but brilliant career helped steer the study of slavery and Reconstruction, meaning the period from 1865, when the US Civil War ended in a triumph for the Northern or Union forces, to 1877, when that essentially military occupation of the former slave states of southern United States was ended. Away from white slaveholders and toward freed African Americans, and who oversaw a gender discrimination report that spurred her profession to address sexism within its ranks. She died at a retirement community in Baltimore, Maryland. Johns Hopkins University, where she taught from 1973 until her retirement in 1992, announced the death but did not give a cause. Given her very advanced age, she probably died of natural causes. Dr. Rose unfortunately suffered a stroke in 1978 that severely curtailed her academic work, limiting her scholarly output to little more than a collection of essays, a compilation of primary source documents, and a single full-length book, Rehearsal for Reconstruction, published in 1964. Yet that book and the scattered works that followed proved so influential that Dr. Rose was credited with standing at the fore of a revolution in the field of US history. She belonged to a generation of historians who dismantled the prevailing view of Reconstruction as a tragic era or time period for the South. Under an interpretation that became known as the Dunning School, radical Republicans were said to have ravaged the former Confederacy in the post-Civil War years, working with ignorant African Americans and corrupt Northern whites to undermine the Southern culture and politics. Black suffrage, of course, the right to vote was given briefly only to adult African American men, was seen as a political failure. The system of Jim Crow segregation that followed was justified as a political necessity. Under this system, as we know from our general knowledge of the US history, a great majority of the African Americans who had had the right to vote were deprived of the right to vote through such techniques as the so-called grandfather clauses. In other words, those people voting age who were US citizens whose grandfathers had been able to vote, and then eventually, grandfathers had been able to vote, were given the right to vote. Then there were poll taxes, which many, if not most, African Americans there in the southern states for a long time were unable to pay. Then there were literacy tests. They were asked to recite lengthy portions of state constitutions and even asked to interpret them, while similar tests were not necessarily given to white voters. And then downright violence and intimidation and lynching and so forth. And then, of course, having separate schools, separate churches, separate hospitals, even separate sections of seats on board buses, separate toilets and so forth. Even separate beaches and park benches and other recreational areas. Within the academy, Dr. Rose and her peers all but obliterated that school of thought, spotlighting the efforts of well-intended, or maybe well-intentioned, reformers and introducing the perspective of newly freed slaves who sought to exercise their freedom for the first time. She introduced real nuance in a subject that has too often been dealt with as a question of black and white, good and evil, said Eric Foner, a historian of the Civil War and Reconstruction. According to him, Dr. Rose was one of the very first to look at the former slaves themselves as major actors. Her dissertation and first book, Rehearsal for Reconstruction, presented a chronicle of Reconstruction in miniature. It focused entirely on the sweeping changes that occurred after Union forces seized control of South Carolina's Sea Islands in 1861, freeing some 10,000 slaves. For the most part, officials left the freedmen's fate to a group of teachers, preachers, doctors, and abolitionists known as Gideon's Band, a proto-Peace Corps unit that helped the former slaves establish schools and an island economy. A few of the volunteers lined their pockets, Dr. Nose wrote it, while Sea Islanders became as self-governing as many a small England town. The late Amherst college historian Henry Steele Commager, famous for his the pocket book of the history of the United States, declared that the book was assuredly a definitive work. It received the Allan Nevins Prize for Best Dissertation and the Francis Parkman Prize for the Best Work of American History, the first time a book had received both prizes given by the Society of American Historians. Partly as a result of her newfound prominence, Dr. Rose was appointed to lead a committee charged with evaluating the status and treatment of women in the field of history. And in 1970, she presented her findings to the American Historical Association. The document was known as the Rose Report. She calmly worded her indictment of gender equality. She noted that while elite graduate departments back then granted about 15% of their doctoral degrees or PhDs to women, men constituted 98 to 99% of their faculties, with women serving primarily in the lower ranks. As a result of the findings, the American Historical Association agreed to work toward expanding the number of women in the field and increasing the opportunities available to them. One 2007 survey found that women made up about 35% of all history faculties. Born as Willie Lee Nichols in Moneta, Virginia, in May 1927 and raised in nearby Bedford, the future Dr. Willie Lee Rose graduated at the age of 20 from Mary Washington College, which is now known as the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. In 1949, she married William G. Rose, a mechanical engineer who later became a photographer. Mr. Rose died in 1985. They had no children. In 1976, Dr. Rose became the first woman selected as the Harold Vivian Harmsworth Visiting Professor of American History at the University of Oxford in Britain. Also in 1976, she published a documentary history of slavery in North America, which featured commentary on slave letters, planters' diaries, songs, advertisements, and other primary sources. According to the Boston Globe, Dr. Rose was scheduled to write a volume on the Civil War for the Oxford History of the United States, a sweeping survey of U.S. history aimed at a general audience, when she suffered the stroke that all but ended her career, so back in 1978. Her final book, a collection of essays, speeches, and book reviews titled Slavery and Freedom, was edited by her Johns Hopkins colleague William W. Freeling and published in 1982. The book received rave reviews from historians such as Robert F. Durden, who praised her treatment of slavery as a dynamic, changing institution that evolved over time. The essays seemed to point toward a project that was unfulfilled, another book or another shelf of books that might have explored Dr. Rose's suggestion that the study of slavery can illuminate the spirit of freedom. And this was actually a shortening of her obituary found on the website of the Washington Post. Its author is Harrison Smith, and I only have filmed this video for educational purposes, so I don't intend to infringe on any copyrights. Bye-bye.